In the aftermath of President Kennedy's assassination, a legacy of secrecy and deception is born.
If you believe the witness testimony that there were two shooters in the plaza, either means conspiracy or one of the world's most unbelievable coincidences.
Now, 46 years after the assassination, an informant has come forward to reveal the mob's darkest secret.
You know, when it comes to murder, he was a genius. He could get anybody killed.
And if that's true, think about what it means. The mob killed our president. And they got away with it.
(1985), Texarkana Federal Prison. A bank robber strikes up an unlikely friendship with a mafia kingpin, the notorious boss of the Louisiana mob, Carlos Marcello.
I don't know why he would tell me things, but I know that we got along very well together. I liked him and despised him. There were times that if you didn't know what he had done to people over the years, that you would really like to be around him and talk to him.
The bank robber would become an informant for the FBI and soon hear the Godfather make a startling admission.
In my guts, I was so shocked and horrified.
A confession that, if true, might finally solve the nation's most infamous and enduring murder mystery.
As though something has happened in the motorcade. We understand there has been a shooting. We can't see who has been hit, but apparently something is wrong here. Something is terribly wrong. And just now we've received reports here at Parkland that the president was hit in the head.
President Kennedy has been assassinated. It's official now. The president is dead.
For nearly a half a century, it has remained the subject of intense debate. Did Lee Harvey Oswald act alone?
Come on, man. President. No, I'm just a patsy. President.
There is a substantial body of witness testimony in the plaza that said that shots came from different directions.
I think that most people get bogged into the question of the single bullet, what happened, grassy knoll shooters, puff of smoke, as opposed to the much more difficult question of if it was Oswald, was it part of a conspiracy or was he doing it on his own?
But in a split second, the man in the middle of it all is silenced.
He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot. There's the man with a gun. It's absolute panic. Absolute panic.
Who was Jack Ruby? And what really drove him to kill Oswald?
Jack Ruby was no national hero who was just pained by how the death of JFK would have hurt Jacqueline Kennedy, which was his story. I mean, that's preposterous on its face.
With the nation stunned, the new president, Lyndon Johnson, acts quickly.
We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. For me, it is a deep personal tragedy.
7 days after JFK's death, Johnson directs Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren to investigate the assassination.
The Warren Commission conducted basically a shooter investigation. Who pulled the trigger?
The Warren Commission concluded that there were 3 shots fired in Dealey Plaza. All came from the rear, and all were fired by Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone.
While the press at the time largely accepts the commission's report, much of the public simply doesn't buy it.
There was tremendous pressure on that commission to see what happened as an isolated, bizarre act that didn't have other evil implications of internationalism or organized crime.
They decided very early that we need to show the American people, not find the truth, but these are what we need to show the American people, that it's not the Russians, and so we don't have to have World War III.
To many, the seeds of JFK's assassination are sown here, an island 90 miles from Florida. In the 1950s, the Cuban dictator Batista allows American mobsters to transform Havana into a Caribbean Las Vegas. The partnership reaps untold millions. But all that collapses in 1959 when an army of revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro overthrows the government. As thousands of Cubans flee the island, the mafia is forced out of its casinos. When Castro invites the help of his communist allies, the dreaded Soviet Union, the Cold War arrives on America's doorstep.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
In 1961, the Cuban crisis awaits the new American president. Working closely with his brother Bobby, the new Attorney General, Kennedy takes on Castro. He greenlights plans for a CIA-sponsored sneak attack on Cuba at a place called the Bay of Pigs. But unknown to the Kennedys, the CIA has another scheme in place.
It's very well documented that in the summer of 1960, the CIA began working with the Mafia in a plot to kill Fidel Castro while keeping it secret from the Kennedys.
The mob, which had lost all of its casinos and its gambling operations and that, would love to have been back into Cuba and operating for profit again. The CIA often deals with questionable independent contractors. It has a storied history of doing that. So was it surprising that they had done a deal together with the mob to try to kill Castro? Not at all.
While the Kennedys desperately want to take down Castro, they are adamantly against the CIA hiring the mob to do it, for good reason.
It's very difficult for many people today to realize just how powerful the Mafia was in America in the 1950s and into the early 1960s.
They were vicious, they were violent, and they corrupted public officials.
In every major community of the United States, there is organized crime. It's growing greater and greater every year. Where there is corruption of public officials, and there is some in every major community, that has to be rooted out.
Starting in the late 1950s, the Kennedy brothers launch unprecedented attacks on the American Mafia.
We were breathing down their neck. We were indicting people on a daily basis. They were outraged at the pressures that we were putting on them.
It was a massive assault, but they particularly targeted 3 Mafia families.
In Bobby Kennedy's sights are Sam Giancana, godfather of the Chicago outfit. Johnny Roselli is Giancana's man in Vegas and Hollywood. The boss in Tampa, Florida, Santo Trafficante Jr., maintains strong ties in Cuba and a close partnership with Louisiana kingpin Carlos Marcello.
Carlos Marcello was a particular interest to the Kennedys because he was not a citizen. He had been born in Tunisia of Sicilian parents, then brought to America.
In 1961, unable to indict Marcello, Bobby Kennedy pressures immigration authorities to deport him to Guatemala, the country Marcello falsely claimed as his birthplace.
They put him in handcuffs, put him on an airplane. And Carlos Marcello was a man with a great deal of dignity. And the notion that somebody else would put their hands on him is an insult, a major insult.
And Marcello was livid. This was America's most powerful godfather. All the time he's cursing Bobby Kennedy, whom he blames for everything.
It takes weeks, but according to the Border Patrol, Carlos Marcello gets his close associate and pilot, David Ferry, to sneak him back into the U.S. While the Kennedys have Marcello and the other bosses against the wall, author Lamar Waldron, a longtime Kennedy assassination researcher, believes the Godfathers found a way to carry out the ultimate revenge on the Kennedys.
They had to kill JFK to end the Kennedys' war against them, or literally they were going to go out of business.
In 1961, the newly elected president, John F. Kennedy, and the new Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy, are gaining momentum in their crusade to wipe out the mob. What the brothers don't realize is that the CIA is maintaining an illicit relationship with the same mafia bosses the Kennedys are trying to prosecute.
Unknown to JFK, the CIA was continuing to work with Trafficante, Roselli, and Sam Giancana in a secret plot to kill Fidel Castro.
But the CIA-Mafia collaboration never succeeds.
In the early 1960s, there was a plot between American intelligence and the Mafia to kill a head of state. And it was against Fidel Castro. And they tried 17 times, and they failed 17 times. And guess what? They should hang their heads in shame if they think of themselves as a real assassination group, because they really were terrible.
To the Kennedys' utter dismay, the invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs is also fatally flawed.
The Bay of Pigs had failed in spectacular fashion because it was such an open secret, because so many people in Washington knew about it. And so it became such an open secret that eventually Fidel Castro knew about it.
Many of those involved in the operation bitterly blame JFK for not providing American military support to the Cuban exiles. The failed invasion brings the Cold War to America's backyard. A year later, U.S. spy planes confirm the Kennedys' worst fears: nuclear missile sites in Cuba.
The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
Although JFK publicly diffuses the tense nuclear standoff, privately, he and Bobby realize the Cuban Missile Crisis is far from over.
Part of the deal to end the Cuban Missile Crisis was to allow UN inspections for weapons of mass destruction in Cuba. But Fidel Castro refused. So there was no way for JFK to actually verify that all the Soviet nuclear missiles had been removed.
The Kennedys need a new plan to deal with Castro. Authors Lamar Waldron and Tom Hartman believe that in the spring of '63, a Cuban exile leader and friend of the Kennedys, Enrique Ruiz Williams, brings them one.
This was a very closely held plan because it involved the number 3 man in Cuba at that time, the head of the Cuban army, Commander Juan Almeida. Commander Almeida essentially said, look, I'll stage the coup, I'll eliminate Castro, but this can't be a Bay of Pigs type things. They've got to be willing to fully back me to the hilt if I'm gonna do this.
What made this unique from all of the various CIA plots to kill Castro was that this wasn't a CIA plot to kill Castro. This was the number 3 guy in the government of Cuba reaching out to the Kennedy administration saying, let's work together to have a peaceful transition in Cuba that involves the end of Fidel.
A coup d'etat led by a popular Cuban general may be the Kennedys' best shot at eliminating the Soviet threat nearby. But if the plan is uncovered, it could also bring the superpowers back to the brink of nuclear war. Despite the risk, Lamar Waldron and others believe the Kennedys launched the coup plan with Almeida. CIA documents show the operation codename AmWorld is set for the 1st of December, 1963. Waldron believes that, unknown to the Kennedys, CIA agents Bernard Barker and David Morales leaked details of the Kennedys' top-secret coup plans to their friends in the mob.
Bernard Barker was a longtime operative for Santo Trafficante. David Morales, who ran operations at the CIA's huge Miami station, he had grown very close to Johnny Roselli, working on the plots to kill Castro.
A nivel de gobierno.
And with this knowledge, Waldron asserts that the mob, whose very survival is threatened by the Kennedys, discovers a way to rub out the president and not get caught.
They're going to kill JFK in a way that you cannot possibly fully expose how JFK was killed without also exposing the coup plan, potentially triggering World War III.
If they could infiltrate and blow up this plan to assassinate Castro and in the process kill Jack, then the entire national security apparatus that was trying to protect us from World War III, that entire national security net would drop on the entire thing and seal it up tight for years, maybe decades, maybe centuries.
In the summer of '63, according to the theory, a few of America's most powerful mafia bosses are planning their biggest hit ever. In November of 1963, it's believed the Kennedys are just days from executing their secret plan to eliminate Fidel Castro. But author Lamar Waldron contends that rogue elements in the CIA have revealed the top-secret plot to mafia bosses Santo Trafficante and Johnny Roselli.
The Mafia was able to infiltrate the coup plan by using the connections they had developed with the CIA starting in the summer of 1960, before JFK was even elected. If we flash ahead to 1963, you have Johnny Roselli continuing to secretly work with the CIA without the knowledge of the Kennedys.
Under increasing threat from Bobby Kennedy, it's believed the mafia bosses find in the coup plan a way to stop their real enemy. Not Fidel Castro, but the U.S. Attorney General.
Carlos Marcello very colorfully explained that if you have a dog and you cut off its tail, meaning Bobby Kennedy, the head of the dog, meaning JFK, will turn around and bite you. But if you cut off the head of the dog, meaning kill JFK, then the tail quits wagging on its own. So the Mafia developed their plan to kill JFK, and the first attempt was not in Dallas, but it was actually planned for Chicago.
Secret Service agent Abraham Bolden was one of 13 agents in Chicago preparing for the president's visit on November 2nd, 1963.
About the end of October, we began hearing rumors of an assassination squad that followed him from Miami, as we understood.
A day before the president is due in Chicago, the Miami intercepts take on sudden urgency.
A lady called the U.S. Secret Service office. She said that she was a landlady in a building where there were 2 Cubans were staying, and she went in to do something in the apartment, and she saw 4 rifles in the room. Also in the room there was a newspaper, and she thought it was turned to the route that President Kennedy was supposed to take.
The Secret Service puts the group under surveillance.
During the process of keeping them under surveillance, one of the agents got too close to one of the suspects. In fact, that the suspect heard his radio go off, and right away they began to pack up and they fled.
Bolden's fears intensify when another suspect, an ex-Marine with ties to militant anti-Castro Cubans, surfaces in Chicago.
And so it was decided that the Chicago police would pull this guy over for any reason whatsoever so that we would get a chance to search his car.
2 hours before JFK's planned motorcade, Chicago police stop Thomas Arthur Valley. In the trunk of his car, they find an M1 rifle and 3,000 rounds of ammunition. Even more troubling, agents learn that Valley works in a printing company that overlooks the president's motorcade route.
Valley had several interesting parallels to Lee Harvey Oswald. He was an ex-Marine like Oswald. Both Valley and Oswald at the same time got jobs along the projected motorcade route for JFK.
At 9:15 a.m., as eager bystanders line the president's motorcade route, JFK's press secretary abruptly announces the cancellation of the president's trip.
The Mafia didn't have 3 different plans to kill JFK. They had one plan and tried it in 3 different cities. The second city where they tried was 4 days before Dallas and Tampa, Florida.
2 weeks after the aborted Chicago motorcade, JFK is scheduled to pass through the turf of Mafia godfather Santo Trafficante.
That day, JFK had the longest motorcade in America of his entire presidency. And the chief of police, who I talked to about this, said they advised the Secret Service to tell JFK to cancel, not to come. There was no way they could possibly protect him.
But Waldron and others believe that JFK could not cancel for a very important reason. They say that night, JFK was scheduled to give a speech, which he knew Commander Almeida would be listening for in Cuba.
Buried within that speech would be 2 lines that the CIA had helped to carefully write as reassurance for Commander Almeida in Cuba.
No Cuban need feel trapped between dependence on the broken promises of foreign communism and the hostility of the rest of the hemisphere.
And so JFK made the calculated decision to go ahead with that motorcade, despite the advice of the Tampa Police Department, knowing he could be shot at any time. What we know now is that Santo Trafficante found out the police knew there was an assassination plot, and so Trafficante called off the attempt.
But others see no diabolical plot.
They can point to other instances in which there was even a Marine that had some similarities to Oswald in Tampa, and Chicago had similarities to that, but that's where it stops. It's just guilt by association. The Secret Service received about 1,300 threats of what they consider against the president's life. You have to ask the question, is there a tie from Oswald to the other attempts? And that's where the linkage fails.
President Kennedy, his wife with him, flew to Texas today on a political or non-political trip.
But some conspiracy theorists believe that one of the masterminds behind the plot, Carlos Marcello, though 500 miles away on trial in a New Orleans courthouse, has things under control in Dallas.
If the mob wanted to take out Kennedy, how would they do it? They could either send somebody in a black shirt and a white tie and a machine gun, and everybody would know the mob just did it. What they would do in this kind of situation is not do that. They would try to have a cutout, somebody who would not look like the mob, and he would take it.
12 years after the controversial Warren Commission concluded that Oswald had acted alone in killing the president, Congress launches a new investigation of JFK's assassination.
I heard Ms. Kennedy say, "They've killed my husband. I have his brains in my hand."
By 1979, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, led by veteran Mafia prosecutor G. Robert Blakey, has come to a very different conclusion than the Warren Commission.
Trying to make a judgment about what happened. And it's my best judgment that he was killed as a result of a conspiracy. And the shape and color of the conspiracy is organized crime.
Blakey's investigation examines a mountain of new evidence, including hundreds of hours of secret FBI wiretaps of Mafia godfathers.
We got surveillance from all over the country in the 11 months before the assassination. And it's interesting, there's a conversation in Philadelphia between the head of the family at that time. We ought to whack Kennedy, we ought to whack the big one, the little one. They were talking about killing the president, killing Robert Kennedy. All of a sudden, I'm in the conclusion that they certainly had the motive.
But the FBI has no wiretap on one of the underworld's most powerful leaders.
They didn't have the surveillance on Carlos Marcello that would have given me the kind of information that would indicate that he did it or that he didn't do it.
In 1977, the committee takes on the mob directly and subpoenas the testimony of the godfathers themselves.
So I'll take the Fifth Amendment because it may intend to incriminate.
Suspiciously, though, two of them are now unavailable to appear. A year earlier, Johnny Roselli's decomposing body was found floating in a Miami canal. And one-time boss of the Chicago outfit, Sam Giancana, is also dead, shot 7 times in his own kitchen.
Carlos Marcello had a sign in his office that said 3 can keep a secret if 2 are dead. He and his partner Santo Trafficante seemed to be able to put that into practice.
Out of money and time, and facing a lack of cooperation from the CIA and FBI, Congress closes the committee's investigation in 1979. In the years that follow, the chance of penetrating the JFK conspiracy seems to steadily fade, until a shocking confession is heard inside a federal prison. In 1985, Thomas Kimmel, an FBI supervisor who specializes in organized crime, is sent to run a field office in Texas.
Carlos Marcello was in prison in my territory, so it looked to me like this was a very worthy target really to determine whether or not Carlos Marcello still held sway over the New Orleans La Cosa Nostra.
Inside Texarkana prison, Kimmel launches a secret investigation into Marcello's criminal activity.
Our investigation was initiated without any reference whatsoever to the JFK assassination. Of course, you never know what you're going to get when you start into these investigations.
The operation depends on a reliable informant. For 22 years, this man has kept his identity and his story a secret, until now.
What brought me into Texas penitentiary is that I was convicted of bank robbery, and I was sentenced to 8 years. When I got to the penitentiary, I wouldn't have known a mafia from a 5-cent cigar. He was dressed in the most beautiful tailored shirt, and his shoes were Gucci. They weren't prison issue. He had pure white silver hair.
Over months, Jack Van Laningham and Carlos Marcello, the oldest inmates in Texarkana, become friends. According to Jack, the camaraderie attracts the attention of prison staff, and he's summoned to a secret meeting with an FBI agent.
He said, "Jack, I'm in a position to make you an offer. If you can get information that we need, you'll walk out of here a free man." I said, "Tell me something, do I have any real choice in this or don't I?" He says, "No, you don't." He says, "You haven't got no choice."
Jack says the FBI arranges for him to become Marcello's cellmate. He is also instructed to buy a personal radio from the prison store.
I said, "Marcello, I hope you don't mind. I bought me a radio. I like to listen to music. I know you do." I put it up on his case. The radio was transmitting to a tape deck that ran 24 hours a day in Dallas, Texas.
Hundreds of hours of audio tape are recorded in Marcello's cell. But many of their conversations occur not on tape, but in the open space of the prison yard.
And we're sitting there and just shooting the breeze, and he said, just out of a blue sky, "That dirty swine had me flown out of the United States to Guatemala." He wasn't mad at the president, he was mad at his brother. But he knew that if he could get to the president, it was the end of the Attorney General. And these sort of things, Marcello wasn't no dummy. You know, when it comes to murder and planning things and crime and dirty things, he was a genius. And we're sitting there, and he said, "I'm gonna tell you something. I had the little bastard killed, and I would do it again. He was a thorn in my shoe." I quote. Marcello realized what he had said. And, you know, we started talking about other things. In my guts, I was so shocked and horrified. I knew that I had had enough, and I couldn't tolerate too much more of this.
As soon as he safely can, Jack reports what he heard to his FBI handler.
And I explained to him exactly what I had heard. He says, "You know, you're gonna have to take a polygraph." I said, "Fine." I said, "Look, things is coming to a head here. I am scared every minute of my life with the things that you're doing and me caught in the middle."
Van Laningham's burden grows as he claims to hear more about how the mob assassinated JFK. In 1985, Jack Van Laningham, an FBI informant, hears New Orleans godfather Carlos Marcello make a startling confession.
He admits to me, "I had the little bastard killed. He was a thorn in my shoe." I quote. He didn't bullshit. He very seldom said anything that was really incriminating, but he even knew himself when he looked at me after he said it.
In the long months ahead, while Jack Van Laningham waits for the FBI to free him, he maintains that Marcello tells him more about the assassination.
He told me that the shooter was his boy, had him down to his farm in New Orleans numerous times. I said, "Who are you talking about, Carlos?" He says, "You know who I'm talking about. The guy they claim shot Kennedy from the book depository." He says, "The guy was my man. I had him in my pocket. I had him in my pocket. He did what the hell I told him to do." And he said, "We figured the cops was gonna blow him away when they saw him up in the depository. But they didn't." That is on tape. Ruby is his man in Texas. He's running his organizations there. He's skimming off of Marcello. He owes him. He owes him big. He could have had him killed, but he didn't. He kept him in his pocket for what he was planning.
On the morning of November 22nd, 1963, the President and First Lady arrive in Dallas for a motorcade through town. Lee Oswald, a 24-year-old ex-Marine with a professed allegiance to Marxism and Fidel Castro, goes to his day job at the school book depository above Dealey Plaza. He allegedly sneaks in a cheap mail-order rifle with a scope attached. 500 miles away, in a New Orleans courthouse, attorneys working for Bobby Kennedy unsuccessfully try to prosecute Carlos Marcello for conspiracy to commit immigration fraud.
He probably had a lot going through his mind. He was probably also hoping that things would go well this time in Dallas and they wouldn't have the problems they had in Chicago and Tampa.
Though the Warren Commission never links Oswald and Ruby to Carlos Marcello, later government investigators found otherwise.
Jack Ruby had come from Chicago as a small-time rackets figure to Dallas and was known as somebody who was on the fringe of the criminal life there.
The strip bar that he ran had the women on the circuit from New Orleans, from a bar owned by Carlos Marcello's brother. So I now have organized crime associations between Jack Ruby, the man who killed Oswald. What's the case with Oswald? Can I connect Oswald to organized crime?
If he really was a fervent pro-Castro communist, investigators theorize that Oswald could have been recruited by Cubans under a false flag.
Cubans would come to Oswald and would fly what's called a false flag. They would be really organized crime, and they would fly the Castro flag. They would draw Oswald into a conspiracy, and then Oswald would kill in behalf of Castro, not in behalf of Marcello. But for Oswald to be recruited, he had to be known to the organized crime people. Well, sure enough, Oswald is born and raised in New Orleans in an area that's as tough as you can get. Turns out his uncle is a bookmaker for Carlos Marcello.
Oswald also appears in this 1955 photo with one of Carlos Marcello's closest associates.
This is Oswald. Before he goes into the Marines, he was in a civil air patrol, and the individual who leads the young men is a man named David Ferry. David Ferry turns out to be the private investigator for Carlos Marcello.
While many investigators credit Oswald and Oswald alone for shooting President Kennedy, to other government experts, the evidence, including this footage shot by Abraham Zapruder, tells a different story.
And as it turned out, it's the most important piece of photographic documentation that we have of the JFK assassination. And what it shows, as far as I'm concerned, is clearly that Kennedy is struck. His hands come up thusly toward his throat and mouth. His body leans a little bit forward. Then you see the head wound and the crimson burst as the president's skull explodes. According to the Warren Commission, the shot has come from the rear, fired by Oswald. I believe that there were two shooters, and in my opinion, one was firing from some other position in the Texas School Book Depository building, and the other one was firing from behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll. And that explains the movement of the president's body backward when he struck.
People focus too much on the forensics at Dealey Plaza. They think about, is there a second shooter, a first shooter, whatever else. Even if I'm right that all the shots came from behind the president, and that the person who killed the president that day fired with Oswald's gun, you then have to determine whether Oswald was in fact the assassin, and even if he was the assassin, was he doing it for himself or for somebody else?
The afternoon of the shooting, Oswald is arrested in a Dallas movie theater.
Look at what he did after he was picked up. One of the most significant things he did is ask for a lawyer. And the lawyer he named is John Abt. John Abt is a very prominent communist lawyer in this country. Oswald thinks that what he was doing was done in behalf of the communists. He expects Abt to show up. Of course, he doesn't. He is now getting no support from anybody connected to the communists. Oswald's not a fool. He's going to suddenly realize he's been had. They have to take Oswald out before he talks.
Former congressional investigator G. Robert Blakey thinks the mob needs to find somebody who can get close to Oswald.
That's Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby has lots of connections with the cops. They all know him, and that police station was not sealed off. Lots of people could get in and out, including Jack Ruby. I think after the assassination, I think it's that night, I think they found him in his sister's apartment. She says he was making phone calls, and at one stage he goes in the bathroom and throws up. Over what? He can care less about Kennedy. He just got a phone call. Jack, we want you to do something for us. What he now knows is, if I don't, I'm dead.
Less than 48 hours after JFK's assassination, Jack Ruby, from point-blank range, shoots Lee Harvey Oswald dead. For some, Ruby, like Oswald, is not part of any mafia conspiracy, but simply a lone nut.
I think that Jack Ruby believes he's doing the right thing in his rough and tough world. That guy shot the president. He deserves to be dead. And when he's tackled and pulled off, he's shouting, "It's me, it's Jack Ruby, you know me." And later tells one of the police, "I did it for you, you couldn't do it." It's very interesting that I think Jack thinks he's going to walk free a hero. He completely underestimates what he's done. He's ruined the case for history. He's closed off the chance of getting the real answers from Oswald, and he's forever embedded in most people's mind that it's a conspiracy.
In 1964, during a prison interview with Warren Commission investigators, Ruby pleads with them to take him back to Washington, D.C., where he can safely tell them the real story. But his request is denied, and 3 years later, Ruby succumbs to cancer.
There's a report about 5 minutes ago by the Dallas Police Department to all of its officers that the president had died.
I was stunned. I couldn't believe it. We went home and watched television like everybody in America for 48 hours while this thing all played out.
It's a heart-clutching thought to think of those two children in the White House.
It was a nation in mourning. It was the end of innocence in this country, I think.
While the nation reels in shock, in the Tampa hotel where the president had spoken just 4 days earlier, Godfather Santo Trafficante reportedly toasts JFK's death. Lamar Waldron believes that Trafficante, along with Johnny Roselli and Carlos Marcello, have pulled off the mob's most daring hit ever.
Bobby Kennedy himself, as we now know, had looked into JFK's assassination privately, secretly, not as the Attorney General of the United States. And he had concluded Carlos Marcello was behind his brother's death. The mob bosses knew that if they could connect the killing of JFK somehow with this incredibly secret coup plan, that would prevent a full investigation of JFK's murder. They knew how secret and sensitive this was, and it was the only way the Mafia could really force Bobby Kennedy himself to cover up so much information. He was doing it to prevent World War III.
This was right after the Cuban Missile Crisis. You had Khrushchev saying, you mess with Castro, you mess with Cuba, and we will launch nuclear missiles at you.
What still perplexes many are the reportedly numerous government cover-ups that followed the assassination. When Secret Service agent Abraham Bolden tries to tell the Warren Commission about the threats against JFK in Chicago, he is deemed a traitor and silenced by his own agency.
When I put on that badge as a Secret Service agent, I said that I would give my life for President Kennedy. I meant that. I still feel an obligation to continue this until these real assassins are brought to justice.
In 1986, FBI informant Jack Van Laningham would say goodbye to his cellmate, Carlos Marcello.
They sent me down, and he came down to see me off, and you can believe it or not, but he had a tear in his eye to see me go. I was glad that I was going.
Van Laningham maintains it took 3 more years for the FBI to administer a polygraph in which he verified hearing Marcello confess to JFK's murder.
There's still hundreds of hours of audio tape secretly recorded by the FBI of Marcello that have never been released to this day, and some of those tapes do involve people like Jack Ruby.
Do I think that the informant actually heard Carlos say that? I think maybe he did. Do I know that for sure? I do not.
Still, Jack Van Laningham feels the FBI should have done more.
Here's the guy that admitted killing our president. Just think of all the hours and the days and the months of tape that they have. I know damn well he could be charged for what was on those tapes.
Shortly after being released from prison in 1993, Carlos Marcello dies of natural causes. For some researchers, there is no conspiracy behind JFK's death, just a simple, painful truth.
You take this young, charismatic president with so much potential for the future. On the other side, you put a 24-year-old sociopathic loser like Oswald with a $12 rifle. It doesn't balance. You got to put something heavier on the Oswald side to make it seem as though that death wasn't in vain, that things aren't so random. And a conspiracy does that very nicely.
But Waldron and other researchers believe that definitive proof of this conspiracy may someday emerge.
I think there's still a lot to be learned from all the files that haven't been released. The CIA has 1 million records alone they have not yet released.
I think the mob killed Kennedy and got away with it. And if that's true, think about what it means. The mob killed our president, and they got away with it.